It was that rarest of things, a glorious, sunshine-filled May morning in Edinburgh. I was heading into New College early to the study lab to beat the throngs of General Assembly commissioners who'd soon be pouring through the gate. A short way ahead, a small man in a grey suit hurried along, clearly a keen commissioner. Midway in the quad, he suddenly stopped in front of the statue of Knox, bowed his head solemnly, and then he continued on. I wondered what Knox, the man who preached sermons with pretty unambiguous titles such as Vehement Against Idolatry, which did lead to the smashing of statues, well, I wondered what he'd have thought. The shadow of the wee man in the quad, as he's been called, stretches well beyond the 16th century. Knox has variously been described as the superhero of Protestantism, a pantomime villain, arch misogynist, even the man who made Mary Queen of Scots cry. Such descriptions have turned Knox into a bit of a cardboard cutout caricature. So in this wee whistle-stop tour, let's try to move beyond the myths, the misunderstandings, and perhaps even the misogyny, to find a glimpse of Knox the man, a man who was strangely human. Knox was born around 1514 in Haddington, East Lothian. He was born into a merchant family and had an older brother called William. Possibly there were other siblings, but there's no record of them. His early formal education was probably at the song school at St Mary's in Haddington. There he'd have learnt to read using the liturgical books at hand, while musical skills were gained by singing in the choir. Later he would move to the borough school, where he'd have been given a thorough grounding in Latin, and here he'd have become acquainted with the Vulgate Bible. And even as an adult, it was this version that would spring to his mind immediately. Knox was a bright student and, as a younger son, opted for a career in the church. In his mid to late teens, he went to St Andrews University. Now, Knox was a lover of the spoken word even in his early days, and he delighted in the cut and thrust of university debate. He got a reputation for being a bit of a bruiser, always looking to land that killer blow. And on occasion, he'd get so caught up in making his point that he'd actually undermine his own argument. It was a trait that would go through his life. In 1536, Knox was ordained first as a deacon and then later as a priest. But by 1540, he'd moved back to Haddington and he was working as a notary, a country lawyer, if you like. Aware of Protestant teachings, by the early 1540s, Knox was moving in his theological thinking, and by 1543 he began working for two local lairds who were Protestant sympathisers. He was working as a tutor to their sons. Through itinerant preachers such as Thomas Gillam and John Ruff, Knox would have heard sermons featuring the key Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone. It was the preaching of George Wishart, however, that truly stirred Knox. Wishart preached on Christ as shepherd in December 1545, and hearing the call to follow, in the January of 1546, Knox accompanied him for 5 weeks on his preaching tour. During the meetings, Knox would proudly carry a large two-handed sword, acting a little like Wishart's bouncer. Although, given that he was a merchant's son, Knox was probably not a great swordsman. Wishart knew that he was on borrowed time. His semi-public preaching had caught the attention of the authorities. On the night of his arrest, Wishart took the sword from Knox and ordered him back to his young students. Wishart was tried and executed for heresy in St Andrews in March. In response to his death, Archbishop Beaton, who'd presided over the trial, was assassinated, and the Protestants took possession of St Andrews. The siege was protracted, and in the Easter of 1547, Knox went with his pupils to St Andrew's Castle. It was during this time that he heard the call to preach, and this is where we see the very human side of Knox. During the siege, the preacher, John Ruff, overheard Knox teaching his young charges the basics of the faith. He was impressed. He met with Knox and urged him to become a preacher. Now, surprisingly, given Knox's later reputation as a forthright and bold preacher, he was very reluctant to take up the call to preach. So when he was asked to do so by Rough, he refused outright, stating that he'd not been called by God. Rough was having none of this. During a sermon, Knox was publicly challenged from the pulpit. At this, Knox promptly burst into tears and he ran off to his room. Poor John. For several wretched days, he wrestled with his conscience before finally agreeing. When the siege ended with the arrival of the French fleet and the recapture of St Andrew's Castle, Knox was sentenced to serve on a galley, which he did for 19 back-breaking months. During this early period of his life, Knox developed the virulent anti-Catholicism, which became one of his hallmarks. This time also says something of Knox's inner strength. Working on a galley is supposed to kill you. Not Knox, however. It turned his sinews to iron and his blood to vinegar. Knox moved to England upon his release in 1549 and became a preacher in Berwick. In 1551, he moved to London, having been appointed a royal chaplain to the young King Edward. 1553 was a mixed year for Knox. He was betrothed to Marjorie Bowes. But while he was on a preaching tour, he lost his job as chaplain because Edward died. Edward's Catholic sister Mary claimed the crown and encouraged all foreign Protestants to leave. Knox struggled with this decision. Was it better to die a martyr or live to fight again another day? Eventually he fled to the continent and spent the next 4 years in exile, first in Frankfurt in 1554. It was a brief and turbulent time there due to congregational disagreements over liturgy and vestments. After a fiery and rather pointed sermon, burning his bridges, Knox left for Geneva in early 1555. Calvin's city-state was a model of Protestantism in action and became a blueprint for reform when Knox later returned to Scotland. In the meantime, while on a quick preaching tour in Scotland in 1556, Knox's very long engagement to Marjorie Bowes finally turned into wedded bliss. The marriage split the Bowes family, however, and with Marjorie's own parents' marriage irretrievably breaking down, Knox not only gained a wife, but also a live-in mother-in-law. Marjorie and Knox had 2 sons, Nathaniel and Eliza. Back in Geneva, among family and with like-minded colleagues and friends, Knox flourished, and his years in Geneva were probably the happiest in his life. The slide here shows a satirical print of Knox and his colleague and friend Christopher Goodman. It makes a reference to the pamphlet produced by Knox, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. It's probably one of the most misunderstood documents in history and has been used to show that Knox was an inveterate misogynist. However, its primary purpose was to make a political point aimed squarely at Mary Tudor. Unfortunately for Knox, ever the one to try and make that killer blow in an argument, he overdid the rhetoric. This was made worse through a case of classic bad timing. By the time the pamphlet was published, Catholic Queen Mary had died and Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, was now on the English throne. She was less than amused by the pamphlet. As the stirrings of reform grew, supported by powerful nobles, Knox returned to Scotland in 1559. In Perth, he preached a provocative sermon resulting in a riot. Statues were smashed and altars destroyed. In the autumn, Knox became Minister of St Andrews, but not for long. With the death of the Regent Mary of Guise in June 1560, peace was secured, and in August the Reformation Parliament abolished papal jurisdiction and the celebration of the sacraments according to the Roman Rite. The founding texts of Scottish Protestantism, the First Book of Discipline and the Scots Confession of Faith, were closely associated with Knox, and they were vigorously championed by him. Knox was at the centre of things now as Minister of St Giles. It was a time of great triumph for Knox, but also great tragedy. His beloved wife, Marjorie, died in the December of that year, and he was utterly devastated and left to bring up his sons, aged 3.5 and 2. In 1561, however, the return of Queen Mary from France helped to serve as a distraction to his grief. The idea of a Catholic monarch on the throne was intolerable for Knox, even though Mary was prepared to accept Protestantism as the religion of Scotland. All she asked was that she could continue in her own faith privately. This was quite forward-thinking for that time, but for someone like Knox, who struggled with the words diplomacy, tact, and tolerance, it was always going to be a bone of contention. Now, much has been made of Knox's encounters with Queen Mary. Actually, they only met in person 5 times, and it was the 4th occasion where Knox provoked her to tears. This was in 1563, upon his blunt disapproval of a potential marriage to the son of Philip of Spain. This is a wedding we know that didn't happen. She married Darnley instead, which opened up a whole nother can of worms. In 1564, Knox remarried to a young woman named Margaret Stuart, much to the Queen's horror, for through the marriage, he became a distant relative. In our own time, much more has been made of the age of his new wife. Margaret was only 17. Now, while the age difference may have raised a quizzical eyebrow at the time, it wasn't uncommon for age differences within a second marriage. So many women died in childbirth. This was a loving and mutually supportive relationship, and some recently discovered letters of Knox's refer to her fondly as "my Meg." His young wife was an invaluable secretary and helpmate, as well as wife and mother, and the relationship produced 3 daughters, Martha, Margaret, and Elizabeth. And what else of Knox the man? Knox was described as short and stocky, broad-shouldered, with black hair and a swarthy complexion. He had a rather large nose and full lips and deep-set dark blue eyes. He also had 2 very different personas. His public face was that of a prophet, ready at all times to blast the trumpet of warning to protect the church from what he believed was idolatry. And people were known to physically tremble when he preached, such was his power. In private, Knox could be assailed by doubt, lapsing into depression, which would produce bouts of anger and frustration, or withdrawal and relative passivity. As a pastor, he could be sympathetic, even tender, and extremely patient with the spiritual dilemmas facing his flock, and some of them, well, more patient than I am. Secure within the godly company, especially during his Geneva days, this gentler side of Knox flourished, and it was these aspects of his personality that helped to inspire the deep loyalty and affection so evident among his friends and supporters within his various congregations, especially women. In his last years, Knox suffered ill health, and he was faithfully nursed by his young wife. He died in 1572, and not without some humour. Apparently, on his deathbed, he requested a cask of wine be opened for visiting friends and joked with them that he might be finished before they had. Thank you.